Welcome, everyone. I am Rodrigo Silva, the Communications Manager at Untitled Press, and I would like to welcome you all to this webinar, where we will be exploring the forms, design, and impact of European Union sanctions worldwide. This discussion is based on a thematic issue that was published early this year by our open access journal, Politics and Governance. I will be sharing the link with you all soon. Let me introduce very quickly today's speakers. We have Katharina Meissner from the University of Vienna in Austria. She is the co-editor of this issue. Orbie from Ghent University in Belgium. Clara Portela from the University of Valencia in Spain, the other co-editor of this issue. And we also have the pleasure of welcoming Richard Youngs from Carnegie Europe. Thank you all for being here. Before we start, some information to the attendees. So this is the order of presentations for today. Katharina, as co-editor, will contextualize the issue. She will be followed by Jan, then Clara, and then Richard will provide the final remarks. After that, we will jump to the Q&A session with the attendees. And so, to our audience, you are able to write your questions to our speakers throughout the whole session using the Q&A format on the bottom of your screen. We kindly ask you to indicate the name to whom you are directing your question. One final note as well, if you are on Twitter, we invite you to follow Politics and Governance page, following the handle on the bottom of your screen, Cogitatiupag, to be in touch with call for papers, new publications, the impact of our research on blogs, news outlets, etc. And without further delay, I will now pass the floor to Clara and wish you all a very pleasant webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think that we will start by listening to the presentation by Katharina. So please, Katharina.
Exactly. I'm sorry, I switched this Katharina first.
Thank you. Thanks, Rodrigo, and thanks to Clara, and welcome everyone. Thanks to Politics and Governance for organizing this session and this webinar. And yeah, I will start straight away. And I think we all agree that amidst the Ukraine crisis and the military conflict between Russia and the Ukraine, sanctions have become highly salient now during these days. And I think we also observe that in this situation, the question was not whether to adopt sanctions, but which exact sanctions package the European Union and the United States would adopt. So this shows the high saliency and the importance of the design of sanctions. And that's ultimately also what our special issue was about. When we look at the sanctions package now, that was adopted by the European Union against Russia, we see that this is probably the most comprehensive sanctions package the EU has ever adopted autonomously, at least if we look at those autonomous sanctions, but still key sectors like the gas sector, as you know, and as it is all over the media, is still excluded. So this triggered us, Clara and me, to look into the nitty-gritty of the design of sanctions and in which locations or in which areas of decision-making the European Union adopts sanctions and who exactly is targeted by these sanctions. So we were interested in how the design of sanctions by the European Union looks like and what motivates the EU to adopt different designs and different packages of sanctions. And this is not a trivial question for two reasons. One reason is that in recent research, the design of sanctions, so which sectors are included, how does the European Union adopt sanctions, has recently been identified as a key to the ultimate success of these sanctions. So the very design of sanctions also implies or has implications for the very effectiveness of these sanctions and how they trigger a change of the target. And the second reason why this is not a trivial question is that the design of sanctions bears domestic and international consequences. And sometimes also distributive consequences. When we look at the sender states, economic sanctions especially have consequences and trigger externalities for domestic actors like firms, for example, or the EU member states, as we observe now with the sanctions package imposed on Russia, but obviously also for the target state in the international arena. The design or different designs of sanctions bear different implications and distributive consequences. And when we look at the design of EU sanctions, we observe that first, in the last 10 years, the EU has been more and more active to adopt sanctions. And the second is that in recent years, the EU has also turned again towards economic comprehensive sanctions packages, like those imposed on Russia, but also if we look at sanctions packages against Myanmar, for example, Iran and Syria. And now I turn to the main findings of our special issue, and I want to pick three key findings, since then we open up to the other contributors and to the discussion. So one finding is that the European Union has a wide variety of different areas and policy instruments and policy areas with which it can adopt sanctions. So usually when we talk about sanctions, we think of the classical common foreign and security policy sanctions, the restrictive measures. But we observe in the special issue that especially also trade and development cooperation are important locations for the EU to adopt sanctions. And two of these instruments are the generalized scheme of preferences that Jan is going to talk about, and the other one is trade agreements and connected to trade agreements conditionality clauses, but especially lately also dispute settlement mechanisms that are linked to trade agreements and that the European Union can use in order to work on or operate on a sanctions basis, so to speak. We also observe in the special issue that the European Union has lately adopted so-called social sanctions that are lower key, like naming and shaming of targets and of wrongdoings. Low politics, or behind the big scenes of politics, diplomatic endeavors that the EU uses in order to push for sanctions or threaten to sanction. The second finding is that in addition to the design of sanctions, implementation is quite varied in the European Union. We observe a wide variety of different implementation in the EU member states. For example, if we look at how member states implement the different regulations and decisions, but also when we look at the penalties that the member states adopt. And this is, of course, or this has consequences or externalities in the sense that if we observe such a wide variation of implementation, then this has implications for the success and the effectiveness of these sanctions if they are very differently imposed and implemented within the sender states of the sanctions. The third finding that we observe is that the European Union has lately made a much more assertive use of economic power. So this is linked first to the increasingly frequent use of economic sanctions packages that we observe lately in the last 5 to 10 years, I would say, but also a more general assertive use of geoeconomics that the European Commission now also enshrined in its communications with the open strategic autonomy and the geoeconomics approach. And this is likely also, of course, to trigger criticism and to have implications for the EU's legitimacy abroad when we think of potential targets or also the states that the EU trades with, if the EU is now much more assertive in using its trade potential and its economic power. And I think it will be quite interesting to the audience to listen to the different contributions. So I stop here and hand over to Jan.
Absolutely, Katharina, thank you very much for this contextualization. We'll be hearing now from Jan Orbie.
Thank you indeed. So indeed, this will be a different perspective, maybe a more general one. I was wondering actually, with Putin's war in Ukraine, I'm very sure this paper in a special issue is maybe the odd one out. It deals with a very specific niche kind of sanctions. It applies to developing countries, only to some developing countries, not major powers like Russia. And nevertheless, I think it's important still to of course to analyze the GSP, including its sanctions, for probably two reasons. A first one is that we may discuss for a long time the causes of the war, and also Putin's heavy aggression, and condemn it in every possible way. But if you look at it from a distance, the least we can say is that apparently the idea of the West that would inspire the rest of the world with its liberal democratic model, etc., the idea that Europe would rule the 21st century as we used to think in the 90s, has failed. So that magnetic force, normative power, whatever you call it, has apparently not worked. And this is exactly what post-development theories also actually point, as they point us towards critical narratives or critical perspectives on Western narratives. A second reason, I think, is that the GSP is niche, but it is generally in EU discourse, which we analyzed, seen as the flagship or the crown jewel, the model of normative trade policy of the EU. So in a way, so to say, it's sort of the best case to look at if you want to know the EU's worldview and how it implements this in a domain where it has significant power, namely trade policy, where also all member states, of course, implement in a similar way, etc. So that would be indeed the place to look at. And just very briefly on the GSP, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it is a little bit technical and complicated, but basically it has an incentive dimension, the green part, it has a sanctioning dimension. The two are intertwined, but incentive dimension implies that a country, a so-called beneficiary country, but we will problematize this notion of beneficiary, receives a better market access. That means lower tariffs, right? If it complies with a number of conventions or just by virtue of being a least developed country. On the other hand, countries can lose these so-called privileged market access and can receive a higher tariff if it fails to comply with a number of international conventions, for instance, on labor, on environment, etc. So this would be the sanctioning dimension. And what we basically do in this paper is we try to problematize really this whole system from a post-development perspective. And for this purpose, we first elaborate what is a post-development framework. We construct a pragmatic framework along three pillars, so to say. First, when it comes to the vision, a developmentalist view on trade, that we clearly see that the whole GSP system is inspired by the idea of export-led growth, the idea that developing countries should climb the ladder towards becoming more like a European economy. And that is linked to a rather paternalistic assumption that we should help them to do that. We should help them to offer, to grant, so these are the terms that are constantly used in the GSP discourse, to grant trade preferences, to grant trade privileges. So this is a common reasoning, not only with the European Commission, also in the Parliament, also among NGOs. I think we analyzed nearly 500 texts in Vivo, and there's a clear consensus actually on this across the political spectrum, with very few exceptions. And of course, this implies that some things are also ignored or silenced. For instance, the fact that GSP market opening, liberalization through GSP, sanctioning through GSP has negative consequences on human rights, on deforestation, for instance. On the other hand, that we Europe, we the EU, we are beneficiaries too. So we consistently frame it in terms of us helping them to give them better market access, and they are beneficiaries. But cheaper imports are also benefiting some EU retailers, some EU businesses. This is actually an argument that also is made in another paper in the same special issue by Cicurelli and Poletti. They also look at the political economy of the GSP towards Myanmar, and they make quite a similar point there. Then secondly, in terms of power, we find that GSP discourse displays to a large extent what we call a performance of power. We see again amongst policymakers, but also in academic analysis, also in some of my own previous work, an obsession with power, the GSP as a tool, the GSP as leverage, the GSP as indeed being a powerful intervention in other societies. And there is also the dimension of dialogue. There is also the dimension of engagement, of monitoring, but we show in the paper that this dialogue, this monitoring is in fact happening in a very asymmetric context, of course, and also that there's really a lot of pressure from the EU there to intervene. We also see techniques of blame shifting responsibility towards so-called developing countries and their governments, through scorecards, for instance. Well, one argument that we make there, and that you would certainly make from a post-development perspective, would be that it obfuscates any attention for systemic injustices, for trade injustice, for structural injustices, so to say, in the global trading system and the global value chain systems, etc. So this is completely ignored. And thirdly, there's the epistemic dimension. Or what you could call epistemic violence, which is key to many post-development, post-colonial, etc. contributions, referring to how the EU measures and classifies, labels third countries into categories like least developed, lesser developed, vulnerable countries. There's actually a sui generis EU definition for what is a vulnerable country, which is relatively discretionary and without attention for the lived experience of the very people that the EU claims to champion. And then in the paper, we also give some snapshots, but merely snapshots of the situation and the discourse in Cambodia and in the Philippines. And in both cases, we find there's amongst elites a clear anti-colonial critique against the EU sanctioning through the GSP. So it is clearly very sensitive. On the other hand, we see that the whole developmentalist logic and the assumptions that I have just problematized, that these are not really critically addressed. And there's certainly also in the research a lack of attention for grassroots perspectives, for possible alternatives to the development paradigm, etc. And this is our main conclusion. Maybe a few final notes. First of all, we found this quite striking, also because the EU development sphere, so to say, has actually been aware of the problematics around the concept of development aid, developing countries, and we have a commissioner for international partnerships now. We have a DG international partnerships. So in the development jargon, we talk about partnerships, no longer about development. In the trade sphere, including the connection with sanctions, the old discourse, so to say, seems still to prevail. Secondly, there's a GSP reform ongoing now. So there's a commission proposal and on reforming the GSP for the next 10 years. And there too, we see that the existing system, the incentive system and the sanctioning system are merely refined. They are made more sophisticated. There will be an extension of the number of conventions. For instance, there will probably be the possibility of more quickly sanctioning. Also, there will be more involvement of NGOs in the monitoring process. So we see this merely as a refining of the current system without really problematizing the developmentalist paradigm that is underneath. Voila, this is in hopefully less than 8 minutes, Rodrigo, our paper.
Perfect. Thank you, Jan, for the presentation. And now, and correctly, we'll be hearing now from Clara Portela.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So I'm hoping that this will be unproblematic. So can everybody see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thanks a lot. So the paper I'm presenting is a paper that is co-authored with Thijs van Laer, who was actually in charge of conducting the interviews. So the material, the empirical material on which this article is based, it was conducted on site in Zimbabwe and in Ivory Coast by my co-author Thijs van Laer. So the reason they gave an impulse for this paper was that we have had targeted sanctions as one of the main tools of the CFSP already for some 20 or almost 30 years. And there has been very little discussion between the fit of the design of these measures and the impact that they actually had. So we actually wanted to find out from those individuals that have been blacklisted, what were their experiences linked to the effects of these sanctions. So we explore this fit between theory and actual impacts with original interviews with individuals that were targeted by the European Union in the crisis that unfolded in Côte d'Ivoire between 2010 and 2011, and in Zimbabwe in a much longer time frame, 2002 to 2017. The reason why these case studies were chosen was because the blacklists that the European Union produced were quite long, and they included regular politicians. In other cases, basically the individuals blacklisted are oligarchs or businessmen or middlemen, or well, basically individuals that are operating in the context of a rebel group, and all of them are pretty difficult to reach. But in this particular case, they were more accessible precisely because they were politicians, and many of them are will continue to be active. Plus the situations that the EU was trying to address in Zimbabwe and in Côte d'Ivoire, well, they were not exactly the same because there was some bloodshed, some violent conflict in Côte d'Ivoire, which was not really the case in Zimbabwe. But in both cases, we have typical instances on which the EU imposes sanctions, namely situations of democratic backsliding. So if we look at what theory says, we find that targeted sanctions are meant to transpose the logic of comprehensive sanctions to the individual level. And there is also some expectation that, or at least many scholars have highlighted the idea that the threat of sanctions can be more effective than its actual imposition. And I mean, we have also witnessed some scholars highlighting some difficulties with the use of targeted sanctions. But as I mentioned already, we wanted to hear from the individuals that have been targeted. So basically, we formulated two expectations. One of them concerns the individual level. So we posit that designations are intended to have disruptive effects on the political and professional activity of targets, and sometimes also on the subjective well-being of the designated individuals. But at the same time, we do not really expect to modify their political views and their behavior. At the collective level, by contrast, what we posit is that the designation of high-ranking officials can promote the discussion of possible remedial action in decision-making circles. But at the same time, it is also susceptible of strengthening elite cohesion. So we took the methodology consisted in identifying those individuals and conduct first-hand interviews with them. The individuals identified were 6 Ivorians and 5 Zimbabweans. And the method that we used was simply semi-structured interviews that were based on a pre-established interview guide. Okay, so basically at the individual level, what we found was a confirmation of our expectation. Designations had disruptive effects on the political and professional activity of the targets, and sometimes also on their subjective well-being. But they did fail to modify their political views. Actually, many of the interviewees expressed frustration at the way in which the international community had handled the crisis, and they felt that they had personally no responsibility in the actions for which they were being penalized. At the collective level, we actually did not find any evidence that designations of high-ranking officials had promoted the discussion of possible remedial action in the relevant decision-making circles. Instead, we did find evidence that they strengthened elite cohesion. So what do we conclude from our investigation? Well, first of all, it is confirmed that designations do inconvenience the targets. So we are not talking about tools that lack any impacts on the targets, as it is sometimes claimed. At the same time, we also found that these impacts did not translate into the modification of policy or even the discussion of remedial action among decision makers. In some cases, the interviewees were unaware of the fact that they had been blacklisted. At least they claimed that prior to the interview, they had no knowledge of the fact that their names featured on a blacklist. And secondly, what we also found is that long blacklists tend to foster cohesion and social bonds. So not only among the members of decision-making circles, but also between those individuals and their social entourage. So the lack of awareness that some interviewees reported about their own listing is a worrying sign, not simply because the fact that sanctions are imposed should be felt, should be known to those individuals designated, but also because it shows that there was no attempt to negotiate with these individuals, no interaction with the individuals trying to modify their behavior while they were under threat of sanctions. So lack of awareness of the listing also implies that there was a lack of threat or a lack of use of that threat in order to try at least to influence the situation. And finally, this lack of dialogue for remedial action is also seen by the interviewees merely as punishment rather than as a measure that can constitute an incentive for the modification of their behavior. So thanks a lot. I think that I also met my 8-minute limit. So back to you, Rodrigo. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara. Yes, we're all very good there. We will be now hearing from Richard Youngs from Carnegie.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. I'm the outsider here as the person who didn't contribute to the volume, but I was asked to offer a few brief reflections on the relationship between the academic findings and policy trends, policy developments. Here, I think the focus of the volume is extremely welcome. As Katharina said at the beginning, we see over the last several years clearly a growing, intensifying focus on sanctions within EU policy debates. The Russian invasion will undoubtedly compound this general tendency in EU foreign policy. And as she said, the EU now has quite a complex multi-level framework of sanctions and conditionality that work at multiple different levels. And I think this volume will clearly be one of the star contributions to dissecting and understanding how this framework works. At the same time, I think from a policy point of view, we shouldn't get carried away. The focus on sanctions is extremely welcome, But I still think overall there are many more cases of the EU choosing not to use sanctions than to use sanctions. So I think the focus on explaining the design and the impact of sanctions is extremely important, and this volume is a very valuable contribution. But I think equally important is to understand that overall the EU is still an actor that generally eschews the use of sanctions, tries to use other kinds of tools rather than very punitive instruments. So I think the balance is needed between explaining the increased use of sanctions, but also where in most cases the EU still prefers to avoid these kinds of measures. I think a really interesting question linking the policy world and the academic world is also one related to points that Katharina made at the beginning. She made the correct point, an important point, that a lot of these new sanctions are very expressly tailored towards the EU's own interests, and explicitly so. I think the trade defense mechanism that is now being introduced is the most obvious case of that, but there are others as well. And yet other instances of the new sanctions are clearly more values driven. They're more tightly tailored on particular rights and much more narrowly defined in that sense. So it seems to me that sanctions, we have a curious situation where the increased use of sanctions is simultaneously more interest driven and in some cases more values driven as well. I think if we relate that to these decades old debates about whether the EU is a normative power or not, it's actually quite interesting that we're seeing both tendencies, the more values driven, more normative and more geopolitical dynamics increasing at one at the same time. And both of those are kind of distilled in this increased use of sanctions on the EU's part. Clearly, to me, reading it from a policy point of view, I think what we see is a divide between the academic world and the policy world. Most contributions to the volume, and I think Clara and Katharina bring this out very well in their overview, express multiple layers of skepticism towards sanctions, towards their design, towards their implementation, towards their impact. And yet, despite that, we see a huge increase in the EU's use of these sanctions. So someone reading it from my perspective, and the obvious question is why we have this divide. It may be that in some cases, policymakers are simply not aware of the kind of nuanced, sophisticated evidence and arguments that you are putting forward. In other cases, it seems to me that policymakers are aware of this evidence, but maybe they have other reasons for using sanctions that somehow are not captured fully in the frameworks you're employing. I don't have the answer, but it seemed to me that's the really interesting question that arises from this. And related to that, the really crucial question, which is that given that most of the contributors are critical of sanctions, are the criticisms really so fundamental to mean that the whole use of sanctions is intrinsically misplaced? Or is it a question of improving the design and precise ways in which sanctions are used, which could render those sanctions more appropriate and effective in the right circumstances? And I think we get different answers from the different chapters in the volume to that most crucial of questions. I interpret Clara's very kind of nuanced and focused study as pointing out that perhaps in some cases there were improvements that could be made in the design of the listings, the sanctions, that could actually mean in certain circumstances they are still appropriate. Better identification of the individuals involved, more dialogue with local actors in identifying better conditions for when individuals are taking off the listings, and so on and so forth. So interesting, Clara, I think you know this more than I do. If you talk to policymakers, they will say that recently they have made improvements in the processes through which individuals are identified to be on listings, and they engage in more dialogue over when they should be put on and when they should be removed from the sanctions lists. Be interesting to hear from you whether you think those improvements are meaningful, whether the improvements can in certain circumstances mean that we can get better results than we see in the two case studies you've offered. But if we then move to Jan clearly offers a much more fundamental, principled critique of sanctions, it seems to me, than Clara's chapter does. I think Jan's chapter in that way raises many very difficult questions from a policy point of view. It may be because you're taking a very strongly normative point of view. One may agree with your normative point of view. I wonder if some policymakers may react to your question with the kind of so what question. Yes, sanctions are about power. Yes, sanctions are about our interest, but so what? It may be that people dealing this not from so much from the development perspective that you're talking about, but from the geopolitical perspective would say, well, of course, that's what we want. We want sanctions that are about power, that are about more assertive means of leverage for our own interests. So I think that's a policy relevant issue that may emerge from your chapter. But I guess you probably almost anticipated this, Jan, in your initial remarks. I wonder for you if the question is where you draw the line. You make a very powerful and convincing critique against the EU kind of foisting its own vision of development and trade on other societies. But when we talk about core fundamental rights being breached, as we are now in the case with Russia and Ukraine, are you still critical of sanctions as a tool? Are they still about the imposition of power, neocolonialism, so on and so forth? Or are there cases when you think that they are normatively appropriate? For me, the really interesting area from a policy point of view you open in your chapter is to say that the way of squaring that circle, of answering that question, is the importance of engaging with local actors in the way that the sanctions are designed. But I also interpreted you, and it'll be interesting to hear you more on this, Jan, you're actually fairly skeptical that the EU's ways of including these local actors are genuine, that they do give local voices a genuine impact over the sanctions, or whether it's just cosmetic and window dressing. So I wonder what it would take in a way because if you talk to policymakers, they would say that we are doing this more, that this is the way of making these more inclusive processes. They're actually the way of using sanctions to foment more open and inclusive political processes around these kind of measures. So are there certain circumstances in which you would buy into this logic, and there are ways of designing these processes better? I think I've probably almost used up my minutes, Rodrigo, but I would finish off perhaps just to put on the table, where reading this extremely good and interesting volume, I was just wondering if there might be 2 or 3 areas for future research that might address some of the policy questions that I know are at the forefront of practical foreign policy agendas today. One of the standard conclusions is, and I think policymakers realize this, sanctions can't achieve much on their own. The key question is how they dovetail with other policy tools. So it would be interesting to hear your 3 reflections on this. And what more can be added in terms of kind of evidence of the relationship between sanctions and other tools. One of the promises in the EU's toolbox at the moment is to say that where aid is cut back, where there are aid sanctions, then that aid should go to non-governmental organizations. So the aid is retained, it just goes to a different set of beneficiaries. Seems to me it would be interesting to have evidence on whether that kind of repurposing of aid can actually work, whether it can be effective, whether it's a way of combining sanctions with positive support for the capacity of local actors on the ground. It seems to me a final question then relates back to Katharina's initial point. There are so many different sanctions regimes that the EU operates now, on so many different issues, at so many different levels, using so many different tools. I wonder if we actually need a good framework for explaining how they all relate to each other. The Russia sanctions are about conflict, then we have non-proliferation sanctions, we have human rights sanctions, now we have trade sanctions, trade defense sanctions, and so on and so forth. So as a final word, it'd be very interesting to hear your reflections on this, because it seems to me that is actually the really crucial question going forward. Is the EU likely to get itself in a bit of muddle because it's got so many different sanctions, arguably operating across purposes with each other?
Thank you, Richard, for your comments and for engaging with the remaining presentations. I will perhaps, before jumping to the questions, give the floor again to our speakers to address some of the comments that Richard just made, perhaps starting the other way around now. Jan, can we have a couple of minutes to listen a bit? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Richard. I think you summarized that extremely clearly, and you're asking some very pointed questions. I will say from the beginning, I'm not probably going to be able to completely answer your questions, but indeed, so what and what is to be done? You are right that it is quite a principled critique of sanctions, and also more of a problematizing than a problem-solving perspectives, which indeed leaves the question, yeah, what to do. A few things. First of all, I think it's important to realize power asymmetries and to not talk about partnerships when we know that a partnership is really not possible, especially if there's such huge asymmetries in trade and also a colonial dimension behind it. To recognize that, also for policymakers to be reflexive about that in how you speak about that, and then also perhaps, yes, to be honest about our interests, to be honest about our power and also about our interests, because this is something we see more and more, I find, in development policy actually, but not so when it comes to GSP and the whole GSP discourse. Really, this is still very much within a very paternalistic language. It's quite striking actually, as other scholars now also start to point out, we also have interests in the GSP. We also benefit from cheaper imports, as I said, etc. So let's just recognize that. I think this would be a very, very important first step. Secondly, to be also a bit more self-reflexive. It links a bit to that, of course, on the EU, to, for instance, in that regard, also take into account the responsibility of our businesses, our multinational companies. And the EU is actually starting to do this now with the new due diligence proposals. We will have to see where that goes. It's just at the level of the Commission proposal now. But the importance of the due diligence proposals is actually that we are going to sanction not faraway countries and their governments, but we are going to sanction our companies who benefit from human rights abuses, etc. I think this is a very, very important signal and a very important step, which links to another point, which is to recognize the whole global value chain. So not to just situate wrongdoings as being located within the boundaries of a third country, but to recognize the systemic nature of human rights abuses in trade, because it links to how the trading system is organized, right? It links to how the free trade system has been organized. It links to speculation on commodity markets, etc. So if you want to address problems in the global value chain, including human rights abuses, etc., we also have to address the global trading system. And I think there should also be then a clearer agenda in that regard. Another thing is when it comes to, I said in the beginning, developing countries, power asymmetry. I think it's then different for countries like Russia, for instance. I think a lot of what we write does not apply to countries that are equally powerful, or at least that don't have, this whole historically, historical dependency relation. So I think that is maybe where I would draw the line, Richard. Although it's it's still hard to say. When it comes to local actors, I think you pointed out that very well. This is something we in development policy have been saying already since the 70s, to recognize grassroots, to recognize local actors. We can only see that it seems to be very difficult to do that, or nearly impossible to do that, and you get a lot of co-optation of very privileged actors in third countries. And this is again something to be recognized. Also, when it comes to studies, to the consultancy studies that are being commissioned you know, we could very concretely, policymakers could explicitly ask the researchers to really take into account and to really take the time and have the resources to make very, very careful studies about impacts on local people, on local actors, and not remain limited to econometric analysis in general, or, you know, to secondary literature. A lot of the GSP studies that we saw actually refer to secondary literature when it comes to impact on the ground. They don't study it themselves, and this is, I think, also a bit of the problem. But I think the main message from also post-development theorizing would be to get your house in order first, also to be therefore more reflexive on the EU's responsibility, on our companies, also on human rights issues within Europe, of course, which are also still happening.
Thank you, Jan. Before we jump to the questions, perhaps Clara and Katharina, respectively, if you can also address some of the elements that Richard said. A couple of minutes before we go to the questions.
Thank you very much. So I'll be very brief so that we can liberate some space for the questions. I mean, you are completely right, Richard. Our paper is critical, but it is not so critical. It is not fundamentally critical. It basically would formulate the recommendation that if you are going to place individuals on a blacklist, first, you have to make sure that you threaten them, or that you announce to them that they are going to be placed on the list, and you try to negotiate with them. You can avoid being blacklisted if you do this and this. And if it fails, then you are going to be placed on the blacklist. But it looks like this sort of interaction never happened. Secondly, as far as the areas for future research are concerned, I believe that Katharina and myself actually wanted to give an impulse to something in this regard. The EU employs different tools as sanctions, not only the CFSP, which is what I was covering, or development, which is what Jan was covering, but also there are trade instruments being activated in order to sanction third countries. So, so far, the approach of the EU has to compartmentalize the use of these tools, so they didn't really interact with each other much. And this boundary is now being crossed because we see how the withdrawal of most favored nation status is being contemplated in the case of Russia. It is actually about to be activated. I think that it would be useful to compare, to contrast the use of these different tools that are adopted under different legal frameworks and see how they interact with each other, if at all. So back to you, Rodrigo.
Thank you. I don't know, Katharina, if you would like to add something.
I would just respond to one of the reflections by Richard, which I found really insightful and valuable. So I want to thank him. And he asked if we need a framework for understanding how the different sanctions relate to each other and what motivates the EU to adopt these different sanctions. And I think it would be extremely helpful to develop such a framework, but at the same time, it would arguably be incredibly complex and complicated, since there is not only the different motivations, but also the different institutional frameworks and decision-making procedures. And I think that already if we look at the CFSP sanctions, then we see multiple pathways explaining and leading to different sets of sanctions. So in another article I published just recently, I show that there is different, essentially two pathways leading to the EU economic comprehensive sanctions packages that are related to the saliency of the conflicts on the one hand, and to United States pressure or United States actions on the other hand. So already there you have this complexity and variation of different pathways. So I believe within the broader set you would have a large variety of different explanations, I feel.
Thank you, Katharina. We have a question here. I'm going to give you to Clara Portela. The question is from Katharina Chiobotaru. She asks about the European Union Magnitsky laws. Are they another tool of CFSP or a more autonomous mechanism, not politicized? Clara, can we hear your takes on this?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. They are just like any other CFSP sanctions tool. It operates in exactly the same way. The only difference is that it adopts a horizontal format so that there is a thematic logic to this list. And this also makes it interesting to observe how the designations are going to take place, because they are now dissociated from specific crises that are taking place in specific countries. So, I mean, it is still early to assess how this is going to unfold. But from the point of view of the listing procedure, the delisting of individuals too, and from the point of view of the kind of measures that are imposed on designees, it works exactly the same. It is as political as any CFSP sanctions regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara. Richard, there are here two questions that I'm going to ask you. I'm trying to merge them to make it easier. It's a question about the past and perspectives for the future. Catherine Jago asks, do you know if any of past European Union sanctions have damaged the European Union? If so, which ones and to what extent? With the invasion of Ukraine, it seems as though future sanctions will. And this meets a question by Paulina Morgina, which asks the possible impacts of new sanctions against Russia for the European Union and its member states. Can we hear your reflections on this?
So I think lots of past sanctions have had negative impacts. I wouldn't know the kind of quantitative studies, maybe others do, but I think my reflection would be, perhaps as a kind of concluding thought on the volume related to this question, was that maybe there's two different types of pathways of sanctions. One is related to cases where there may be some expectation that sanctions can have quite specific impact on the ground. We shouldn't forget that we were going to listen to Maria's chapter as well on Korea, which shows that in some cases, positive dialogue can have an impact on the ground where it's actually disconnected from the threat of punitive sanctions. But there may be cases where particular policy changes might flow from punitive measures. There is evidence that that can happen. But then it seems to me that there's perhaps another pathway, another type of sanction, which is where states engage in behavior that's just so egregious that it's a policy option favoured by the EU, pretty much above and beyond any really specific calculation of what the impact might be. And I think perhaps that's where we are with Russia. It's not so much now, I think, measuring the domestic impact, but just that what's happened is so far beyond the established rules of the game, and so many red lines that the EU and others have established that I think the political calculations probably go, at least for many member states, beyond this kind of very specific look at the quantitative implications.
Thank you, Richard. Katharina, there's a question here by Ana Hernandez. I think I'm directing this to you. She writes, thanks for the very interesting presentation and further comments by Richard Youngs. Dr. Meissner mentioned the challenge of the uneven implementation of sanctions in member states. Which would be the most appropriate? Which would be the most appropriate tools at the disposal of the institutions to deal with this question? Thanks a lot.
It's quite a challenging question, since the implementation not only varies in the member states, but it also varies according to the different measures the EU adopts, even within the common foreign and security policy. So travel bans, for example, and asset freezes have a different dynamic of implementation than, for example, an export ban. I think one measure that could be done, or one avenue that we could think of, is to supranationalize or to delegate export control to the European Union level, to the supranational level, as export bans and import bans are decided upon at the European Union level. And there is also guidelines regarding export control, but still the very decisions on how to control exports is then taken by the member states and the competent authorities within the member states. So this opens up to wide discretion in interpreting the different sanctions packages and the guidelines for export control, but it also leads to a very uneven application. And if we had, we could think of, for example, an agency at the EU level that has more specific guidelines or that reviews these different decisions on export controls. So that would be one step towards a more coherent application and implementation of sanctions, I feel.
Thank you, Katharina, for the answer. Clara, there is something to add.
No, I just wanted to support Katharina's point. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We have reached the end of our webinar. Two final notes before we go. So the thematic issue that was discussed today is available on our website. I have just shared the link once again with you. It is fully open access. You can access it anytime, anywhere. The second note, this webinar was recorded, will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. All the speakers and attendees will receive a notification tomorrow when the video is available. I would like to thank all the speakers, Katharina, Clara, Jan, and also Richard for your presence here. And I would like to thank as well the attendees for your questions and engagement with the speakers. We'll see you all in our next webinar. Thank you very much.